So I am going to just get started, announce the topic of the panel. So this is the task of digital theology. And we are imagining it both as thinking about the specific task, but also what it has done and what is its task going forward. So welcome everyone globally, as well as those of you here in this space together. It's wonderful to have you all join us. I am Kate Ott. I am the Stead Professor of Christian Social Ethics and Director of the Stead Center for Ethics and Values at Garrett Evangelical Seminary in the United States. I'm also a board member of the Global Network for Digital Theology, the sponsoring organization, along with the Church and AI Conference. So are all of the panelists, or at least they were in Katherine's case, given, I believe, her recent rotation off the board and a bit more freedom on her calendar. So I'm going to begin with very brief, and I mean brief, introductions of our panelists for the sake of time. And what I'm going to do instead
Sorry
is...
to interrupt you, Kate.
Could we ask? So if I forgot this tech reminder at the start, thanks. If anyone is logged into the meeting, which we hope you all are here in this room as well, make sure that your laptop, tablet, phone volume is completely off. The actual device volume is off, as well as being muted in Zoom. All right, we'll see if that reminder helps with the echo. If not, I'll go to a new room. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I will say something quickly about how we're going to move through the panel.
Online.
Yeah. Okay.
I haven't got tech abilities. Okay.
So I'm going to introduce them in reverse order of how they will begin speaking for us. Dr. Schmidt is Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Malloy University in New York. Dr. Mokoena is currently an academic in the discipline of theological ethics within the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology at the University of South Africa. And because he recently, given the time at which others on this panel have completed their PhD, we're going to give him a shout out since he recently completed his PhD studies at the University of Pretoria on Ubuntu ethics and emerging technologies in the African continent. Yeah. It's been a bit, and he's publishing and teaching, but I feel like new PhDs should always be celebrated. And Dr. Garner is Senior Research Fellow at Laidlaw College and a consultant at Third Spaces Consulting in Auckland, New Zealand. And those of you who'd like to learn more about each of them, please check out their bios in the chat with links. I already let you know the title of our panel, The Task of Digital Theology. As much as the handbook captures the various ways authors have contributed or defined the task of theology through their work, this panel will also focus on what's next for digital theology. The panel will proceed in the following manner. After I give way and put us on mute in this beautiful room together, we will then hear from Dr. Garner about responding to what's past is prologue, on how things developed in digital theology, where we've ended up because of that, and where we might go next or need to go next. And then we'll hear from Katleho, how do we think about the discipline as being disciplined or post-disciplinary? What are our future responses to this? And then Katherine will respond to the question, what are we post-digital? Should it now just be technology, aka is all tech digital in the field? They each have about 5 to 7 minutes to respond to their individual question. We'll give them a bit of time to respond to each other if they choose to, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for everyone online and in the room together. So Stephen, will you start us out?
Yes, and I'll share my screen because I've got some slides. Okay, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've got a few slides because the pastor's prologue, particularly thinking about how the journey as things around digital theology have developed and how we are going to see where that ends up in terms of doing the task of digital theology as well. So this is my roadmap for digital theology that I play with from time to time. The titles are sort of tongue in cheek, but I'm going to pick a few things from these sort of different eras or epochs or whatever of digital theology development, and then use those to sort of come to my concluding sort of questions at the end there. So first up, the sort of the prehistoric era, like a lot of times when people talk about when does digital theological thinking or faith-based thinking about this kind of digital theology come about, often they might look to the early stuff with dial-up in 1980s, but I tend to look back further than that. And one of the things when I talk to people, particularly church leaders at the moment around AI, and I say we've got 75 years of theological thinking about AI. So in Turing's paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, there's a section on theological objections to machine intelligence. He's not a theologian, he's not a Christian, but he is actually thinking about that kind of thing and how a religious faith might interact with this. Azrael Rosenfeld was a Jewish computer scientist and rabbi. He did a lot of work in the 60s thinking about AI and particularly robots and how that might then intersect with these religious anthropologies and things as well. And then someone like Donald Knuth, who's the sort of the father of sort of modern computer science. And while those are 91 and 2000 publications, they reflect his work and he's a Lutheran, his thinking about faith intersecting with theology and computer science through the 70s and 80s as well. So we've got the sort of background in the back of that. Also, sort of in that sort of prehistory period, a lot of stuff's happening in popular culture. The questions, whether it's, Good News in the Vatican by Robert Silverberg about a robot pope, all these other kinds of things, which are raising questions, which are theological questions in their works in different kinds of ways. In the dial-up world, we saw the arrival of dial-up, and the first uses of dial-up tended to be with pastors and preachers swapping sermons and doing online evangelism and things like that. And then in that sort of 1990s, when cyberspace was all the rage and things like that, we very much had this practitioner-led pragmatism shaping these online engagement in early virtual and online churches. So you see books like, Cyber Church or E-Ministry or the Christian Cyberspace Companion. We see this is probably the first time I encountered something in digital theology was reading an article out of USA Today in 1997 about these monks in the Monastery of Christ in the Desert who were doing web development as part of their calling, a vocational calling in a Benedictine environment. And then, you start to see church communities and other communities starting to develop these different bits and pieces and starting to think about things. In that old time sort of online religion, we see digital religion developing as a field as part of the social sciences. And that continuing practitioner pragmatism and digital theology sort of as something on its own sort of begins to take shape. And so in the digital religion space, you get, these kinds of books, which are sort of classics that we would now engage with from the 2000s and maybe a little earlier sometimes. We would also see the pragmatism being continuing in different kinds of ways. So practitioner-led, whether that's in ministry or whether that's from, a technological background. And then also we start to see the digital theology going deeper in journal articles and books and things like that, which are starting to come out, and some rigorous sort of theological thinking about digital technology and its implications. And then we sort of see that in the 2010s, probably the rise of digital theology, I would say, as a discipline academically, and we start to see things like mobile technologies, religious apps, and algorithmic religion developing. And so, in that we tend to think of digital theology maybe as a term for doing theology about and within digital culture. And borrowing different methods from different places, both traditionally theological methods, but also social science approaches, say from digital religion, interdisciplinary stuff, the literature predominantly is dominated by Christian theologies, but also there's the development of engagement by other faiths as well. And so you start to see a variety of books actually really identifying as digital theology in that. And global perspectives like this network here and other organizations around the place, which are actually tapping into that sort of global kind of thing. And then finally, what I call the singularity, it's sort of, where we are now, but we're living in that sort of post-COVID environment where a lot of sort of, theological thinking about digital technology during social isolation and stuff like that. The generative AI stuff is very much on the frame at the moment. Public theology and ethics too, and then of course decolonial and post-colonial projects in this area are developing. And so, we see a whole bunch of different kinds of things here, and turning up, whether that's the World Council of Churches, reflecting on digital justice, whether it's the, significant publications coming out of both the Roman Catholic Church, but also Catholic authors and others, and the way in which popular magazines like the Preach magazine here are picking up and thinking theologically about things like AI within church contexts. And so what that leads into is sort of the task of digital theology. And I think one of the things that we do need to talk about is that we need to talk about the fact that it's probably digital theologies rather than a single unified digital theology. So if you're talking about digital theologies that are emerging out of Roman Catholic context, those can be quite different in many ways from Protestant context or Eastern Orthodox context. The digital theologies that are emerging out of South America, and even differences between what's happening in Brazil or Argentina or different places. So we're starting to, we should be talking about there being this body of digital theologies which interact with each other rather than being a singular definition of that. I think in terms of the task of digital theology, one of the things about public theology is often that it's too important to be left to the theologians. I think that's the same with digital theology. We need multiple voices and perspectives and genuine dialogue. Practitioners, scholars, technologists, ethicists, artists, young people, people at grassroots, people of all genders, etc., different cultural perspectives and critiques. And I think one of the things that, I would really be looking forward is, can we feed the last 20, 30 years of digital theology that has come out of our particularly North American and European context, but what does that look like if it is actively critiqued by those in the majority world and actually reflected on what that looks like rather than letting a particular milieu define what digital theology is and not seeing some of the flaws in there as well. And then also different ways of representing our digital theologies. My chapter in the book's on the arts and the imagination, and I worked with a colleague who is an artist in a variety of different capacities. And that changed how I thought about digital theology in the context of that project. So we do need academic writings, but not just Western academic writings. We need, what does digital theology look like? Maybe if it's narrative, or if it's done artistically or poetically or interactively across media. How do we make digital theology intelligible and communicable? This is something, I've been asked to speak a lot in the last 6 months around AI to a whole range of different audiences. And they're not academic audiences. And so it's been not as necessarily a challenge, but certainly trying to find the right language to communicate digital theological ideas in a way that is understandable, comprehensible. Local and global contexts, contextual theologies as well, and the ecumenical and interfaith dimensions to digital theology. How do we partner with others who are different from ourselves? And I would say we need to, potentially pay attention to history and those who've gone before. Often within the digital theological community, but also within the wider church community, we have a sort of sense of amnesia of what people have done before. As academics, sometimes, we know we have to look back to that, but a lot of the people that I'm talking to who are wrestling with things theologically and digitally, have no idea about all the stuff that's gone before and are just trying to reinvent the wheel. So I think part of the task of digital theology is actually making that past resources available to people and alerting them to that, in order that we can build some kind of practical wisdom phronesis for living well with and within digital contexts. I think without that kind of practical wisdom coming out of it, we're noisy gongs and clanging cymbals, perhaps. So that's my take on things. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that paper and sharing your thoughts on the task of digital theology. So I will be discussing how do we think about digital theology as being disciplined or inter or post-disciplinary, and what are future responses to this. For those who were here yesterday, you could have also heard some of the discussions and deliberations, in regards to digital theology as a discipline, and how that conversation sort of sparked from colleagues, to really think deeper into digital theology as a discipline, and also how do we think the task of digital theology as a discipline needs to go in future. So scholars in digital theology have already alluded that digital theology does not fit into a traditional sense of a discipline. Some of the critiques of digital theology is that it is a fad theology, something that quickly gains popularity and then just fades away. And this was also the kind of talk in regards to the internet, how the internet was also labeled a fad technology, and how, it will no longer exist past the 1990s. However, another argument is that digital theology is not a discipline because it does not have its distinct methodology, because it borrows from other disciplines. And we have also heard from Heidi yesterday how digital theology is sometimes treated as a stepchild of digital religion or digital humanities. And then one of the questions I've actually grappled with in thinking about digital theology is actually, where does it fit in the broader field of theology? For an example, when I was studying my master's, I did my master's in the intersection of theology and film. However, at the time, I completed around 2017. But during that time, I did not even know there was a term such as digital theology. However, I was already engaging within the field without actually knowing that it's actually digital theology. However, some of the works, that I've consulted, are within the realms of media, religion, and spirituality. And also, how do you move along in regards to that, in trying to really understand the kind of theology that one is doing? So even when I did my PhD, it was quite a struggle to find a supervisor to really understand what I was trying to do. Around 2020, with the rise, of AI, and also how people were grappling with the phenomenon of AI. So I wanted to do something in digital theology, but I couldn't have the terminology or understand the terminology, or actually where to go about in finding sources so that it can help me think about theology within a digital context. So my supervisor is within the field of science and technology, science and theology. And then the only person that I know in South Africa that really engages with digital theology is Professor Anita Kluter, who's also part of the network as well. However, because of the different institutions, I could not have her as a supervisor. But then also what that also tells me is that, because digital theology, as Peter mentioned also yesterday, is not embedded within academia, which it makes it quite difficult for digital theology to find its footing within academia, because it happens in different pockets around the world. And then also there isn't any synchronicity when it comes to digital theology within different contexts around the world. So I really think we need to rethink, going forward, how digital theology is integrated, in broader theological field, because we can all agree that, it is a discipline. However, if we talk about it as a discipline within a traditional sense, we might be misguided, or we might actually have a short end of the stick there. So I don't think we should keep on attempting to try to prove, that digital theology is actually a field or a discipline. And also, the question of having digital theology as a standalone discipline, I also don't think it is quite helpful, to keep on thinking about it in that way. Because focusing on establishing a proper discipline in the traditional sense might actually be counterproductive. So my thinking around this, and I think it's something that we should keep on thinking about in terms of, how digital theology can actually, be embedded within the theological disciplines. So there's a concept of transversality by a French theorist and activist, Felix Guattari. So it is described as a mode of communication and action that cuts across rigid hierarchies and categorical boundaries. So digital theology as a transversal discipline, we already established that it is an interdisciplinary field. However, when we say it is a transversal discipline, it would cut across, existing theological disciplines without replacing them. So it does not become another sub-discipline, but it runs through all theological disciplines, transforming how each operates from within. So what that means is that biblical studies, systematic theology, church history, practical theology, ethics, missiology, and so forth, can engage, the questions of digitality within their respective disciplines. So in other words, I think we are all digital theologians. However, although it hasn't been adopted, by theologians from different disciplines, but when we look at, digital theology as a transversal discipline, cutting across the disciplines, being engaged within the different theological disciplines, then it takes on a new shape. It takes on, a different kind of shape, rather than having it, as a standalone discipline. So that would require, the task of digital theology would require, theological disciplines to critically understand what digital epistemology, digital ontology, digital culture imply for, the specific discipline's core questions and methods as well. I thank you.
Thank you both for that. Excuse me. Good morning from New York City. I should be pretty quick here. So my question, if you remember, is, are we post-digital? And this jumped out to me for a couple of reasons I think will become evident. So I started by thinking about who the we was in this question. I think, sort of culturally speaking, I think we should probably say no. Despite sort of dead internet theory and these kinds of things, I think that we're still in some ways in a very similar place as we were a decade ago in terms of how most people interact with this. I think AI is, of course, making things a little bit more complicated on that front, but from my perspective as a person who looks at social media, I think interestingly in a little bit of a plateau there. We as a field or a subfield, so I think there's a couple ways to read this. And Kate, in your introduction, you said something about like looking forward, which I understand, but I also think there's a way to read this kind of looking backward. And I think the second part of the question might be helpful in getting a sense of what I mean, which is that should it just be technology? So as I think about the question of like being post-digital or sort of being beyond the digital, I'm also thinking about kind of histories of technology and how this actually plays into some of our conversations. So, it strikes me that maybe this is obvious, but it strikes me that how you approach this question will largely depend on your training. And those of us who were trained before digital theology had any kind of shape, I think we'll understand this sort of what we understand to be within the scope of what we do will largely depend on our sort of home discipline or our home sub-discipline. Although Katleho's sort of journey of advisors that he just gave us actually kind of makes me think that maybe the sub-discipline or the discipline doesn't have as much shape as I thought. But what I will say is that, when I was looking to write about this as a doctoral student in 2010, 2011, I would have loved to have a whole list of people that are at this conference, right? Like that sort of does have a little bit more shape than it used to. So I know that the sort of structural issue is still there, but I think it has more shape than it used to. So, as Katleho pointed out, this sort of discipline or subdiscipline is naturally interdisciplinary, and we can talk about sort of the opportunities and maybe downfalls of that. I was thinking here about what Dave Barry says from Digital Humanities. He says there's a sort of natural disciplinary hybridity, what he calls sort of a post-disciplinary university that we're kind of moving to. And I think those of us in this field have had largely positive experiences with this in terms of both research and teaching. But as both of the other panelists pointed out, this does pose problems with sort of traditional structures, and I'll come back to that in a second. So I was trained by historical theologians, so this very much shapes my methodology. So I'm always thinking about technology in kind of a genealogical sense. I've never thought about digital technology in isolation. I've always been interested in it from a sort of like long history of technology, and I do mean long. So I've always thought about this, for human history, thinking all the way back to, when there was a predominance of oral culture. And then for the tech itself, I've been really kind of intrigued by what media archaeologist Parika says, what he calls sort of the ground beneath our feet, its history and constitution, the systematic study of the various levers, layers, strata, and interconnections that define the earth. So, digital technology requires hardware that is made up of things that are very, very old, and not really what we might call digital, but this kind of works itself into, I think, our conversations about this stuff that we have made the subject of our study. So, I think it is helpful and important to focus specifically on the uniqueness of the digital, kind of how things are different. But that these technologies are always going to be built on sort of centuries of development, and whatever technologies are in the future will be built on this as well. So we're not going to be able to sort of leave this behind. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, maybe this is sort of what both of you were saying. I don't think it's necessary that we kind of limit the questions of digital theology. Some people, and maybe, some of those people are here now, will only be interested in technologies that are properly kind of digital. And that seems okay. I mean, I think the sort of pastoral context might be an instance, and Stephen brought this phrase, practitioner pragmatism, which I think is so good in thinking about this. But others of us, I think, will think about all technologies as part of the discussion, with a primary focus on the digital context. And here, in my own work and others, like the category of culture keeps coming up, and I think maybe we need to be more specific about what we mean by digital culture, because it seems like something that maybe expands the conversation. and in a helpful way, but perhaps we need to be more specific about that. And by we, I mean me. So kind of to end here, in general, I want to humbly propose, and Katleho was going in this direction too, that maybe we're too worried about defining these conversations. I think it's important that we've sort of carved out this space, and this is one of those spaces. I think it's important that we've carved out this space, but I think one thing that has set us apart is that we're not too rigid about both what or who is included in the conversation. And again, though, we do have the problem of traditional structures. So as Kate mentioned, I am rotating off the board. And I know that as a board, we've kind of had a problem of kind of trying to figure out exactly what we are and what we want to do, because we kind of don't want to be too rigid. But at the same time, the models that we have are these kind of rigid academic structures. And so just again, to close, I know I said that, my students hate when I do that. Perhaps it's helpful if we combine this with another question that was sort of on our list of questions that we could think about, which is what's gone underexplored. I do think there needs to be much more in historical theology done on technological matters in the history of the church. So, theologians have long been interested in the development of doctrine, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done about the technological conditions under which such doctrine was developed and received. So a person writing about that now, writing about sort of, church doctrine or sort of the history, cannot help but be shaped by the digital context in doing such work. So this is Barry again. He says, computational logic is entangled with the digital representations of physical objects, texts, and born digital artifacts. So here I think he's reminding us that the digital has reshaped the entire academic enterprise. We know this, right? It makes good sense that folks who were not interested in these questions are more and more interested in these questions as their academic work becomes infiltrated with AI or institutions demand more tech use for better or worse. It seems to me that those of us who consider ourselves in digital theology, whatever that might be, transdisciplinary, subdisciplinary, etc., are more attuned to acknowledging, analyzing, and critiquing the conditions of our own academic work relative to the digital context. I think I'll stop there. Thanks so much. Yeah, I have something for Stephen, or just as a response to Stephen, and it follows on what I just said, so I'll go. So you mentioned kind of being a resource, or sort of being able to provide past resources. This relates to something I said yesterday in the comment section about kind of the nature of our subdiscipline, or whatever you want to call it, as sort of being lots of latecomers to the conversation, right? So I'm wondering kind of if you could say more about that, about providing what you call sort of past resources, or kind of being not reinventing the wheel. Just say a little bit more about that, because I do think that is both pastoral and academic.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think it varies depending on the theological or faith community context you're in. One of the things that I appreciate about, the documents that come out of the Vatican connected with, church and internet back in 2000 or whatever like that, those when you read them draw upon this vast amount of material that sits in encyclicals and other documents and stuff, and is woven in there, which then informs the thinking, whether that's Catholic social thinking or whether it's something else. Within the Protestant traditions, there doesn't seem to be that kind of thing. Lutherans maybe have a bit more skin in that game of doing that, but I see a lot of people just simply saying, say, for example, generative AI is here. We must think about this because no one has thought about this sort of thing before. And so actually part of a lot of what I'm doing is people have thought about this for a long time, and they've written about this, but often not in a way that's accessible for the people who are wrestling with that. So I think part of the task of digital theology is actually to make the riches of the scholarship and the practitioner basis and the technological reflection available in different ways. Now, that's not going to sit neatly in a tenure pack or whatever you're doing to try and get tenure in an academy or things like that. But it is essential work that needs to be done for the wider body of both the trajectory towards faith communities and the trajectory into wider society. So the public theological side of things and stuff like that, as well as incorporating those people who have their own stories, narratives about technology and how it affects them or how they've used it well, or the wisdom that they've developed within their different communities and things like that. So I think that's one of the key things is actually saying there is a lot of resource there. How do you make that available? How do you actually fund making that available in different ways as well, when it doesn't fall naturally into something that might be considered an academic discipline or an academic research output? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just one more thing about that. Like, it just strikes me that like a student who wants to study like Trinitarian doctrine or something would probably never go to her advisor and say like, no one's ever thought about this before, and sort of there's an assumption on that level of like that there's a body of work. And I think you're right that the question for me is like, why is that so different? Why is there kind of like a lack of understanding or a lack of awareness about this body of work? I mean, the very, beautiful, quick history that you gave us, like, why is that there? And so I think there are these sort of structural things, and it maybe has to do with sort of this advisor-student relationship thing that I was pointing to in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, my question also goes out to Stephen. You know, particularly, based on, how there's so much, that has been written, digital theology and all of the subsets and so forth. However, back to the question that we also had for the panel, of the, what digital theology has, sort of like under researched. And I think that is one of those key things to say, although, we are sort of like moving forward in terms of, emerging technologies and so forth, engaging emerging technologies, but, we haven't really gone, back to the source or back to the well of digital theology to really unearth, what has been written before. And I say this because for young people, their whole lives is engaging with the digital in whatever shape or form. But a lot of the young people aren't even aware that there's actually a theology that can assist you in looking at things, within the digital context. And for me, that's how digital theology can also grow, is that when that's introduced to actual young people that are engaging with the digitality, whether it's gaming, social media, and so forth. But we, as the practitioners and scholars, really need to bring all of those elements into play.
Yeah. Yeah. And also reflecting back on the work that you've been doing, Katleho. I mean, I see the work you're doing, and I really appreciate the work you're doing on Ubuntu ethics and trying to bring a local contextual flavor that makes sense for your own community and place. But also, as I look at you working in this, I'm sort of thinking you're still trying to fit it within what the guild has decided needs to be done. And what I'm really wanting to see is what happens if we throw the guild away, if we can. What does digital theology look like if we're not bound to? I mean, we're celebrating an Oxford University Press handbook, so I'm not going to diss that too much. But, it's an Oxford University handbook. The rules of the game were set. So, we're working within that. What if we throw those rules away? What does digital theology look like that could engage with older people, with young people, with people who don't read? What does it look like to do that kind of digital theology work with them? And I think that's one of the pressing things. And yeah, maybe the interest in the latest encyclical on AI will actually spark the need for this kind of communication outside of the academy in different ways. Yeah.
I think on that, we will turn to additional Q&A conversation. So I see Toby, you have your hand up online. Anyone in the room who wants to queue up, we can do that so we can keep track of online and offline for questions. Go ahead, Toby.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to ask about whether in 2026 we're seeing an increase in demand for digital theology and whether you're seeing that inside and outside the church and whether that's something we can understand what it is. Where's the demand for good conversations, for good digital theology? Where's it coming from right now?
Well, I can just speak again to my own context, and this is bearing in mind what Stephen said about how important, kind of pluralizing this is. But I was just at one of the more formal, guildy kind of conferences in my field, and we had a panel about AI, and I was joking with one of my friends that, 10 years ago, they would have told us to get lost. So I do think that in my sort of little world of Catholic, theology of a certain kind, that I'm being asked to do a lot more stuff. And it really is the AI thing. I think that the encyclical, especially for Catholic theologians, is going to bring this up more and more. I can't, churches, I have been asked more to speak at churches, but again, I'm in sort of in a Catholic context, so maybe that makes it a little bit weird. I don't know if there are seminarians and priests talking about this more, so.
Yeah. I think yes, and I think there are a number of factors around people recognizing the need for this, but it's incredibly variable and often incredibly pragmatic. They want the silver bullet for how to use AI or social media or video conferencing within their religious faith community context. They're not necessarily wanting to think more deeply about it. They just want to know what's permissible. And that's certainly what I'm coming up against a lot. I speak, quite a lot to different groups of church leaders and to theological educators and things like that in an ecumenical kind of way. Certainly since COVID threw up a whole lot of things around virtual and mediated communication, which put that people wanted to think about that. The generative AI has very much put that thing. But, social media didn't do that so much, but it did do it amongst you people working with young people who are wanting to deal with the fallout for social media damaging young people. And so that's where it came from. But there was, mostly that was the only context in which I was being asked to speak was in relation to young people for that kind of thing. So I think it is there, but often, often the broader sense of technological ethics and thinking about, what actually is technology and it's the environment we live in. How do we reflect upon that? Isn't, as still as a hard place to go. And yeah, so, 25 years ago, I did a talk on AI and theology and my PhD project. And then I had someone stop and talk to me afterwards to say I shouldn't be doing this because there were no robots in the Bible. And so, 20 years on, I'm still running into people like that who say, well, that's not in the Bible, so you shouldn't be working in this area. So, but on the other hand, you have others who desperately want to know what the digital wisdom is. Everyone knows about literacy, but digital wisdom for how to live in that context. Yeah.
Yeah. In my context, it's very conservative when it comes to technology or emerging technologies. And the immediate response, is to reject without really engaging, on emerging technologies. And I also see, within the academic space, is that people have not really, thought about how is it really permissible to engage the digitality? Yes, during COVID-19, that's what a lot of people were doing, engaging the digitality within that context. But then after that, everyone just went back to their, to their own discipline and focused on whatever, they were doing before that. Also with AI as well, there really hasn't been, yes, people talk about it, but when it comes to really, putting pen and paper down to really, discuss dialogue with it, is still quite limiting. But I also agree with Stephen when it comes to, technology. Churches, for example, they just want, how can I use social media to reach people? How, can we grow the church digitally? But there's also still contention. We have a few churches that live stream, and other churches would say no, that's not, you shouldn't live stream, a church service, for an example. So those conservative conversations, are still there, and it's something that needs to be explored, in regards to, the church being, visible within the digital space.
And just riffing off Katleho there, one of the things that I do see within academic digital theology, and more broadly within the academy, is that disdain maybe, or for the practitioner, for those who are doing it and are just winging it out there and are doing some really amazing things, but because they're not an academic, because they're not a lecturer, because they're not writing in the journals, then what they're doing isn't of value. And I very much think that if digital theology is going to be fruitful, then that dialogue between all sorts of different people in different contexts and backgrounds is going to be needed. And so yeah, it's not just the academics, because we really don't have clues sometimes, unfortunately. Yeah.
All right, great. We have a question in the room for y'all now.
That's muted.
Sorry, we can't hear online. The room is muted.
I double clicked. That was my fault. I double clicked. Sorry.
Because I didn't catch all of the nuances, but I think the issues of the apparent contextlessness of digital theology on the one hand, the issue of historical theology, and the issue of the memory, our collective memory, is really important. And I really wanted to thank all three of you for that. On Stephen's presentation, I've been involved maybe a little bit too long in organisations like Globe Ethics and the World Council of Churches, so I was very pleased to see or noted the references. But I take very much your point about, compared to the Catholic tradition, how difficult it is to weave the history that we have behind us from this whole diversity within the more Protestant tradition. So I just wanted to underline that. Sometimes in the World Council of Churches, I've described myself as an ecumenical dinosaur because I've been around too long, but I flagged up when there was a discussion starting about AI, that there was a reference 20 years ago in a document from the Theological Commission of the World Council of Churches to AI. So I think it's really important to think about how we can weave these narratives of what we've brought with us. And then the question I've got is the one about the public space and public perception. My impression, a little bit, as I'm exaggerating, is with the latest encyclical of Pope Leo, people are suddenly saying, the church has got something to say about artificial intelligence, as though this is the first time anything like that has been said, because of the hyper-individualization we have in the global society. So I'm really looking if any of you can think about how we can raise up the history that we've got that predates this papal encyclical.
And the media power of the Vatican.
And media power of the Vatican.
Yeah. I mean, it is an interesting thing, and certainly that involves all of us being engaged in different ways and having conversations with different people as well. Sorry, one of the biggest things that I took away from the encyclical coming out was the way in which some of the technologists described encyclicals as the Pope's Substack, which I thought was just a really interesting kind of way of thinking about it. And suddenly it reframed it in a different way. But I think there is a history to these kinds of things. There are resources, but what you don't have is a unified body that's able to deliver them through one particular mouthpiece or one particular way. And so, it's really hard to actually do that. And so this is part of the Global Network's job, is to do some curation of these resources, and to do some of this kind of stuff as well, and then working with these other wider organizations too. But there's some good stuff going on, but it's yeah, I run into the average person at a church or something like this, and they're just winging it with whatever they Googled on the internet this week to try and find something. So somehow making those resources available and aware and stuff like that is part of it. And yeah, maybe we need the equivalent of crash course videos or something just to tie that together. And also, to be perfectly honest, churches sometimes just don't play nice with each other ecumenically. So they don't pull the resource to actually genuinely produce something for the wider good of both the public and also for the wider church body, because they're all just looking after their own knitting and protecting their own stuff.
Kate, do I have time to add something, or do you want to move on? So I just as the as a Catholic in the room, I am bound to say that the interpretive structures that existed when these kinds of genre, like the encyclical, or the structures that existed when those things were developed no longer exist, such that an encyclical, like as a Substack, is like, so it's a problem, right? Because it is true that there has never been an encyclical that is so specific about a specific technology like this. I mean, that is quite remarkable. There are lots of things that, at least from the Catholic side of things, that have been said about digital technologies over time, but to have an encyclical specifically that is like focused on a technology is quite remarkable. But everything sort of gets flattened, right? And like LLMs are sort of affecting the way that we are able to read things in terms of levels. It was already hard to argue with students about sort of like levels of teaching. And now it's even harder because everything gets summarized and put forward as sort of like being equal in sort of, this is what the church says kind of thing. It's like, well, who is the church, right? And this is why digital theology is so fun, because then it orients you back towards questions of ecclesiology, about the relationship of the theologian to the magisterium, etc., right? So anyway, I don't know who said that, Stephen, but I have beef with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we can just take it up in a Protestant Catholic argument later.
All right.